Now I want to query my meetup data from the database and use that for my meetups in my template instead of using the dummy data. And for that, I'll get rid of that list here, which I store in meetups. And instead, I want to use that data from the database. Now, I mentioned that the good thing would be that we don't have to write any SQL queries. Instead, we got this meetup model, and we can actually query the database and do database operations through that model. How? Well, in our view, we can simply import from .models, our meetup model in this case. And then in the place where I want to fetch all meetups, we can access it, and then the objects property, which is a static property on that meetup class. So I'm not instantiating the class, I'm accessing a static field, not a field defined by us. We did not add an objects field here, but defined by this base class, which we're inheriting. And this objects field gives us rich query methods. For example, the very simple yet powerful all method, which we can execute like this, and this will simply fetch all instances of this class from the database. So it will give us all the meetups stored in the database. We can also chain more methods here, for example, order by, to then add ordering, but that's not something we need right now. Here I'm happy with just fetching all the meetups. Now I'm then passing them to the template, and here I now also want to get rid of show meetups, and I want to tweak the index.html file a little bit, because here I'm looping for all my meetups, and I get my meetup items here, but accessing the location will not work at the moment, because at the moment the meetups stored in the database don't have a location yet, and therefore here I'll just set a hard-coded value for location so that we don't get an error. Later we'll of course again use data from the database here once we got that data here. But if we now save this, you see now only one meetup shows up here. And that's that meetup from the database, as you can tell by the title. Now I noticed one thing right now. My included snippet here is not ideal, because I did create my title and location here, but here for the slug, I'm still referring to meetup item slug. I should of course also just name this slug to stay in line with the approach I'm using up here, and make sure that in index.html that slug is provided if I want to follow that approach of making it as reusable as possible. And then here that would be meetup item.slug. And since our meetup items do have slugs in the database, this again should work. So if I save that and I reload, I can still click this button and that works. Now that we are on that detail page, we also might want to query the meetup details for that page from the database instead of having a dummy meetup here. And of course, that's also possible. We get the meetup slug as an argument here because it is this dynamic path segment that leads to this function to be executed. And we can query by that segment in the database because all our stored meetups do have a slug and it's guaranteed to be unique. So to do that, we now also want to query the database again, but now not to get all the meetups, but a specific meetup. And that's also very straightforward. We can again use our meetup model, which we're importing up here. And then we access objects, just like before, but now not all, but get, which gets a single instance. And now you use keyword arguments to define which object should be selected. Here we could say that the slug field in the model, so here I'm referring to one of the keys defined in my model, in this case the slug, that the slug field should hold a value of meetup slug, so the slug we're getting as a parameter here. We are looking for an entry in the database where this condition is met. And if no such entry is found, that of course will not return a record. But here we know that we'll definitely have this kind of meetup, and therefore in this case, we can access the title and description. However, no longer like this, but instead now this actually will be an object, so we use the dot notation for that. And if we save that and reload this detail page, now you see we got the actual title here and we got our actual description, which we entered in the admin area. So now that's how we can fetch a single meetup item. Now, of course, if we enter some slug which does not exist, we get an error though, because we're trying to query for an item which is not part of the database. That's why we might want to wrap this with a try block and catch errors like this. And render or return a differently rendered template in that case. So I still pass in request here, and I still might want to render the same template, though we could also render a different template here. But then here I maybe set a meetup found key and set this to false in this case, and add that same key to that other render call here, where I set it to true though. And then in our template, we could simply check if we found a meetup or not. So we could add a if tag here and check if meetup found is true. And also end this somewhere. And define an else case as well. And now we could say if meetup found is true, then we want to display our article. So then I cut this article and I add this here. Else I'll just show some fallback message where I say no meetup found for this slug. Sorry. Of course that should be end if, not just end. And if I now save this and reload, I get no meetup found. Of course the formatting is off, we could change this. But if I do change this back to a correct slug, it works again. And that's one way of handling this error. Alternatively, you could show a different template, or you even redirect the user entirely, for example, to the 404 page. There are many options of handling this. As with so many topics, I do explore this in greater detail in my complete course, but this is a basic form of handling this, which definitely does the trick for us here. And that's overall how we can fetch and use this meetup for a specific slug.